Eleanor Grayson sat on the creaking porch swing of her old Victorian home, the paint peeling like memories she couldn't hold on to. The air was thick with the scent of late summer roses, their petals wilting under the weight of an approaching autumn. At 75, Eleanor's hands were gnarled from years of tending her garden and raising a family. But her eyes still held a spark of defiance. In her lap lay a photo album, its pages yellowed, each image a fragment of a life she'd built with love and sacrifice. Tonight, though, her gaze lingered on a new Wunda glossy vacation photo her son, Michael, had sent her from their family trip to Hawaii. The photo showed Michael, his wife Laura, and their two teenage children, Sophie and Ethan, grinning on a sunlit beach. Palm trees swayed behind them, and the ocean sparkled like a promise. Eleanor wasn't in the picture. Not surprising, since she hadn't been invited. But what cut deeper was the realization that they'd deliberately cropped her out of the family portrait they'd taken at her own insistence before they left. She'd stood there, smiling, her heart swelling with pride, only to find herself erased from the final image. A ghost in her own family story. Eleanor's fingers traced the edges of the photo, her chest tightening. She'd spent decades building a life for Michael, sacrificing her own dreams to ensure he had everything. The late nights working as a seamstress, the weekends spent cheering at his soccer games, the college fund she'd scraped together by skipping her own small luxuries. And now, at the twilight of her life, she was an afterthought, reduced to a phone call every few weeks and a cropped-out figure in their memories. The betrayal wasn't new. It had started subtly years ago, when Michael married Laura. At first, Eleanor adored her daughter-in-law, welcoming her with open arms. But Laura's warmth faded over time, replaced by a cool distance. Family gatherings grew sparse, and Eleanor's invitations to holidays were met with excuses. "We're just so busy," Laura would say. Her voice clipped. Michael, once her devoted son, followed his wife's lead, his calls growing shorter, his visits rarer. The grandchildren, Sophie and Ethan, barely knew their grandmother beyond the occasional Christmas card. Eleanor closed the album, her hands trembling. She stood, her knees protesting, and walked inside to the kitchen, where a pot of tea sat cooling on the stove. The house was too quiet, its walls echoing with memories of laughter that no longer filled it. She poured herself a cup, the steam rising like the questions she couldn't silence. Had she failed as a mother? Was this her fault? Or had her son's family simply decided she was no longer worth their time? The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. It was Michael, his voice cheerful but rushed. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. The trip was amazing, kids loved it. I'll send you more photos soon." Eleanor's heart sank. More photos, she thought, where I don't exist. She murmured a polite response, her voice steady despite the ache. When the call ended, she sat in silence, staring at the deed to her property on the kitchen table. The house, the garden, the land, it was all she had left. Her legacy. And in that moment, a seed of resolve took root. Eleanor wasn't one for dramatics, but the sting of being erased was too much. She'd given everything to her family, and they'd pushed her to the margins. If they could crop her out of their lives, she could do the same. The deed, a document she'd always intended to pass to Michael, suddenly felt like a weight she could choose to lift. She picked up a pen, her hand steady now, and began to write. By the time the moon rose, Eleanor had made her decision. She would rewrite her will, her legacy, her story. If her son's family didn't want her in their photos, she wouldn't leave them her home. The thought was both liberating and heartbreaking. A quiet rebellion against a wound she could no longer ignore. She sipped her tea, the bitterness mirroring her resolve, and began to plan. The next morning, Eleanor drove to the office of her old friend, Margaret, a lawyer who'd known her since their school days. The small office smelled of old books and coffee, and Margaret's warm smile softened the edges of Eleanor's pain. "You sure about this, Ellie?" Margaret asked, her pen hovering over the paperwork. Eleanor nodded, her voice firm. "They made their choice. Maggie, I'm making mine." The process was simple but heavy. Eleanor's property, her home, the 5 acres of land. The orchard she'd tended for decades was worth a small fortune. She'd always planned to leave it to Michael, a gift for his family to grow into. But now, she directed Margaret to draft a new will. The house would go to a local charity that supported elderly community members, a cause close to her heart. The land would be preserved as a community garden, a place for others to find solace in the earth as she had. As Margaret typed, Eleanor's mind wandered to the past. She remembered Michael as a boy, running through the orchard, his laughter filling the air. She remembered teaching him to plant seeds, his small hands digging in the dirt beside hers. Those moments felt like another lifetime, one where she was needed, loved, seen. Now, she was a stranger in her own family's eyes. When the paperwork was done, Eleanor felt a strange peace. She wasn't acting out of spite, though the hurt was real. She was reclaiming her worth, ensuring her legacy would live on in a way that honored her values. The charity would use her home to house seniors who, like her, felt forgotten. The garden would bloom for generations, a testament to her love for growth and community. Driving home, Eleanor stopped at the local diner, a place she'd frequented for years. The waitress, a young woman named Clara, greeted her with a smile. "You look different today, Miss Eleanor," Clara said, pouring her coffee. "Lighter, somehow." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine one in days. "Just making some changes, dear," she replied, her voice soft but steady. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the new will tucked safely in a drawer. She opened the photo album again, but this time, she didn't linger on the vacation photo. Instead, she turned to older images her late husband, George, grinning beside her at their wedding. Michael as a toddler, clinging to her leg. Her parents, long gone, standing in the same garden she'd tended all these years. These were the memories that mattered, the ones that couldn't be cropped out. As she closed the album, Eleanor felt a quiet strength settle over her. She wasn't erasing her son. She was rewriting her own ending. The house, the land, the life she'd built, they were hers to give, hers to shape. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was the one holding the frame. The weeks that followed Eleanor's decision were a blur of quiet determination. She threw herself into her garden, pruning the roses and planting new bulbs for spring. The physical work grounded her, each spade of earth a reminder that she could still create, still nurture, even if her family no longer needed her. The community garden idea had sparked something in her, a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She began meeting with local volunteers, sketching plans for raised beds and a small pavilion where seniors could gather. The thought of her land becoming a haven for others filled her with a warmth she hadn't expected. But the hurt lingered, a shadow that crept in during quiet moments. Eleanor couldn't shake the image of that cropped vacation photo, the way her absence had been so neatly edited out. She wondered if Michael even noticed, if he cared. The silence from his family was deafening. No calls, no texts, no follow-up to the photos he'd promised. It was as if she'd already been written out of their lives. One afternoon, while Eleanor was weeding the garden, a car pulled into her driveway. Her heart lifted for a moment, hoping it was Michael. But it was Clara, the diner waitress, carrying a small box. "Brought you some pie, Miss Eleanor," Clara said, her smile bright. Figured you could use a sweet treat. Eleanor invited her in, grateful for the company. Over tea and pie, Clara listened as Eleanor shared her story, not the full weight of it, but enough to hint at the pain. Clara, barely 25, had a wisdom beyond her years. Family's tough, she said, her voice gentle. But you've got a big heart. Miss Eleanor, you're building something beautiful with that garden. Clara's words stayed with Eleanor, a small light in the darkness. She began to see her decision not as a rejection of her son, but as an embrace of something bigger. The charity, the garden, the community, they were her family now. In a way, she started attending town meetings, pitching her vision for the land. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years offered to help, bringing tools, seeds, and ideas. A local carpenter volunteered to build benches, and a group of high school students signed up to plant the first beds. Eleanor felt a spark of connection, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. But the past wasn't done with her. One evening, Michael called again, his tone different this time, less rushed, more curious. Mom, Laura mentioned you've been talking about some community garden thing. What's that about? Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the phone. She hadn't told him about the will. Hadn't planned to until it was finalized. Just something I'm working on, she said carefully. Keeping busy. Michael laughed, a sound that used to warm her heart, but now felt hollow. You're always tinkering with that garden. Don't work too hard. Okay. The call ended, and Eleanor sat in the quiet, her mind racing. Michael's casual tone stung, as if her life's work was a hobby he could dismiss. She wondered what he'd say if he knew about the will, if he'd even care. Part of her wanted to confront him, to ask why his family had pushed her away. But another part, the stronger part, knew it wouldn't change anything. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming her place in the world. The next day, Eleanor met with Margaret again to finalize the paperwork. The lawyer's office was busier now, with clients coming and going. But Margaret made time for her old friend. You're doing something brave, Ellie, she said, sliding the documents across the desk. Not many people would have the guts to rewrite their legacy like this. Eleanor signed the papers, her hand steady but her heart heavy. She wasn't just signing away her property. She was letting go of a dream she'd held for decades that her son would carry on her home, her memories. As she drove home, Eleanor passed the town square, where a small festival was underway. Children ran through the grass, their laughter mingling with the music of a local band. She stopped to watch, her heart aching with a mix of joy and sorrow. She thought of Sophie and Ethan, her grandchildren, who barely knew her. She wondered if they'd ever understand her decision, if they'd ever see her as more than a distant figure in their lives. That night, Eleanor wrote a letter to Michael. She didn't plan to send it not yet, but she needed to put her feelings into words. She wrote about the love she'd poured into him, the sacrifices she'd made, the pain of being pushed aside. She wrote about the garden, the charity, the new purpose she'd found. And she wrote about the will, not to guilt him, but to explain her truth. I wanted you to have this home, she wrote, but you've built your own life without me. So I'm giving it to those who need it, who see me. The letter was cathartic, a release of the weight she'd carried for too long. By the time she finished, the moon was high, casting silver light through her kitchen window. Eleanor folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer with the will. She didn't know if she'd ever share it with Michael, but writing it had given her clarity. She wasn't erasing her son from her heart, but she was done waiting for him to see her. The garden, the community, the life she was building, they were her legacy now, and she would tend to them with the same love she'd once given her family. The community garden project took on a life of its own. blooming faster than Eleanor could have imagined. By early fall, the land behind her house was transformed. Volunteers had cleared the overgrown patches, built raised beds, and planted the first rows of vegetables and flowers. Eleanor was there every day, her hands in the dirt, her heart lighter with each new sprout. The townsfolk began calling it Eleanor's Garden, a name that made her blush but secretly filled her with pride. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Clara became a regular visitor, often stopping by after her shifts at the diner to help with planting or just to chat. She brought other young people from town, including a shy teenager named Jamal who had a knack for designing garden layouts. "You're a natural, Jamal," Eleanor told him one afternoon as they mapped out a section for herbs. The boy grinned, his usual reserve melting away. Eleanor saw echoes of Michael in him, the same quiet focus, the same love for creating something with his hands. It was bittersweet, but it reminded her why she'd chosen this path. The garden wasn't just a project. It was a lifeline. Seniors from the charity Eleanor had chosen began visiting, some in wheelchairs, others with canes, all eager to share stories and plant seeds. One woman, Ruth, became a fast friend. At 82, Ruth had lost her husband and her only daughter, and the garden gave her a reason to get out of bed. "You're giving us a home, Eleanor," Ruth said one day, her eyes bright with tears. "Not just a place to live, but a place to matter." Eleanor squeezed her hand, her own eyes misty. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. But the shadow of her family still loomed. Michael called again, this time with a hint of irritation. "Mom, Laura saw something online about you turning the land into some kind of public park. What's going on?" "That's our family's property." Eleanor's heart raced, but her voice stayed calm. "It's my property, Michael," she said softly, "and I'm doing what feels right." There was a long pause on the other end. Then a curt, "We'll talk about this later." He hung up, and Eleanor sat staring at the phone, her resolve wavering. Had she been too harsh? Too final? The confrontation came sooner than she expected. A week later, Michael and Laura drove up to the house unannounced. Eleanor was in the garden, showing a group of volunteers how to prune tomato plants. When she saw their car, her stomach knotted, but she squared her shoulders and walked to meet them. Michael looked older than she remembered, his hair thinning, his eyes tired. Laura's expression was guarded, her arms crossed. "Mom, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice tight. They sat in the living room, the air heavy with unspoken words. Laura spoke first, her tone sharp. "Eleanor, we heard you're giving away the property. This is Michael's inheritance. Don't you think you owe us an explanation?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands clasped in her lap. "I owe you nothing," she said, her voice steady but kind. "I've given you everything, me time, my love, my life. And you've pushed me out. You cropped me out of your photos, your vacations, your family. I'm building something for people who see me." Michael's face flushed, but he didn't meet her eyes. Laura's lips tightened, but she said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice low. "Mom, I didn't realize you felt this way. Why didn't you say something?" Eleanor's laugh was soft, tinged with sadness. "I've been saying it for years, Michael. You just weren't listening." The conversation didn't resolve anything. Michael and Laura left, their faces a mix of anger and confusion. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching their car disappear down the road. She felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness. But she also felt free. She'd spoken her truth, and that was enough for now. The garden continued to grow, and so did Eleanor's sense of purpose. She organized a small opening ceremony, inviting the town to see the first blooms. People came in droves, families, seniors, children, all marveling at the rows of sunflowers and zucchini, the benches where they could sit and talk. Clara brought a homemade banner that read, "Eleanor's Garden," and the crowd cheered when Eleanor cut the ribbon. For a moment, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something that would outlive her. That night, alone in her kitchen, Eleanor opened the letter she'd written to Michael. She added a few lines, her handwriting steady. "I don't hate you," she wrote. "I love you. Always will. But I deserve to be seen. And I'm building a life where I am." She sealed the envelope, still unsure if she'd send it. But the act of writing it felt like a step toward healing. Winter came early, dusting Eleanor's garden with frost. The raised beds were mulched and covered, waiting for spring. But the community didn't stop gathering. The charity had begun using Eleanor's house for weekly meetings, turning her living room into a warm space for seniors to share stories and plan the garden's next phase. Eleanor found herself at the center of it all, her days filled with purpose. She taught knitting classes, organized seed swaps, and listened to Ruth and others share their lives. It was a family she hadn't expected, one that filled the holes her son's absence had left. But the rift with Michael weighed on her. He hadn't called since their confrontation, and Laura's silence was even louder. Eleanor tried to focus on the garden, on the people who showed up. But the ache of her son's distance was a constant companion. She wondered if she'd been too harsh, if there was a way to bridge the gap without losing herself. The letter to Michael sat in her drawer, a quiet reminder of words she wasn't ready to share. One snowy afternoon, Clara stopped by with Jamal, who'd become a regular helper. They brought hot cocoa and a stack of seed catalogs, eager to plan the spring planting. As they sat around the kitchen table, Jamal shyly handed Eleanor a sketch of detailed design for a small greenhouse. "I thought it could go by the orchard," he said, his voice hesitant. Eleanor's eyes lit up. "This is beautiful, Jamal. You've got a gift." The boy's smile was worth more than any inheritance, and Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude for these new connections. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. To Eleanor's surprise, it was Sophie, her 16-year-old granddaughter, bundled in a scarf and looking nervous. "Grandma, can we talk?" she asked, her voice small. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen Sophie in over a year, and the girl's sudden appearance felt like a gift and a challenge. She invited her in, offering cocoa, and they sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken questions. Sophie fidgeted, her eyes darting around the room. "I heard about the garden," she said finally, "and what you're doing with the house. Mom and Dad are upset, but I wanted to hear your side." Eleanor took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. She told Sophie about the cropped photo, the years of feeling sidelined, the decision to give her legacy to those who needed it. She spoke softly, not accusing, but honest. Sophie listened, her eyes wide, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. "I didn't know you felt like that," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "Mom and Dad, they don't talk about you much. I thought you were okay with it." Eleanor's heart ached, but she reached for Sophie's hand. "I've always wanted to be part of your life, Sophie, but I can't wait forever to be seen." Sophie nodded, tears in her eyes. And for the first time, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Maybe not all was lost. Sophie stayed for an hour, asking about the garden, sharing bits of her own life school, friends, her love for art. Eleanor listened, soaking in every word, grateful for this small bridge. When Sophie left, promising to visit again, Eleanor felt lighter. She didn't expect miracles, but the connection was a start. The garden project grew through the winter, with plans for a spring festival taking shape. Eleanor worked with the charity to secure funding. Her days filled with meetings and phone calls. She was tired but energized. Her purpose clearer than ever. The townsfolk rallied around her, offering donations and time. Ruth, now a constant presence, helped organize a knitting group to make blankets for the charity's residents. "You've given us a family, Eleanor," Ruth said one evening, her hands busy with yarn. Eleanor smiled, her heart full. But the question of Michael lingered. Eleanor finally decided to send the letter. She mailed it on a cold February morning, her hands trembling as she dropped it into the mailbox. She didn't know how he'd react, but she needed him to know her truth. The act of sending it was a release, a way to let go of the pain without letting go of her love. A week later, Michael called. His voice was quiet, almost broken. "I got your letter, Mom," he said. I didn't realize how much we hurt you." Eleanor listened, her heart pounding. They talked for an hour, not resolving everything, but opening a door. Michael promised to visit, to talk more, to try. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. As winter softened into spring, Eleanor stood in her garden, watching the first buds break through the soil. The greenhouse was under construction, Jamal's design coming to life. She felt a quiet pride, not just in the garden, but in herself. She'd faced her pain, reclaimed her worth, and built something beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, her family would find a way back to her. Spring arrived, and Eleanor's garden burst into color. Sunflowers towered over rows of tomatoes and lavender, their vibrant hues drawing visitors from across town. The greenhouse, now complete, gleamed in the morning light, a testament to Jamal's vision and the community's effort. Eleanor spent her days tending the plants and welcoming newcomers, her heart swelling with each smile, each shared story. The garden had become more than a project. It was a living testament to resilience, to the idea that love could bloom in unexpected places. The charity had officially taken over the house, turning it into a community center for seniors. Eleanor still lived there, but the rooms were now filled with laughter and activity. Ruth led the knitting group, Clara organized cooking classes, and Jamal taught a small gardening workshop for kids. Eleanor marveled at how her home, once so quiet, had become a hub of connection. She felt needed, seen, alive. But her family remained a tender wound. Michael's call after the letter had been a step forward, but he hadn't visited yet. Sophie, however, came by often, bringing sketches of the garden and shy questions about Eleanor's life. One afternoon, Sophie arrived with Ethan, her younger brother, who was quieter but curious. "This place is cool, Grandma," he said, running his hand over a sunflower's broad leaves. Eleanor's heart leapt at the word grandma, a title she hadn't heard in years. She showed them the greenhouse, telling stories of her own childhood in the orchard. For the first time, she felt like a grandmother, not just a name in their phones. The spring festival was the talk of the town. Eleanor and the volunteers planned a day of music, food, and garden tours, with proceeds going to the charity. The event drew a crowd: families, local officials, even a reporter from the county paper. Eleanor stood at the podium, her voice steady as she welcomed everyone. "This garden is for all of us," she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "For those who feel forgotten, for those who need a place to grow." The applause was warm, and Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. She'd done this. She'd built this. To her surprise, Michael and Laura attended the festival. They stood at the edge of the crowd, their faces unreadable. Eleanor's heart raced as she approached them, unsure of what to expect. Michael hugged her. A quick, awkward embrace. But it was something. "This is incredible, Mom," he said, his voice soft. Laura nodded, her expression softer than Eleanor had ever seen. We didn't know you were doing all this, she said. It's beautiful. They walked through the garden together, Eleanor pointing out the raised beds, the greenhouse, the benches where seniors shared stories. Michael listened, his eyes lingering on the community he hadn't known his mother had built. Laura asked questions, her usual sharpness replaced by curiosity. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Eleanor felt a cautious hope, a sense that maybe they could rebuild something. That night, after the festival, Michael stayed to talk. They sat on the porch swing, the same one where Eleanor had held the cropped photo months ago. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, his voice heavy. I didn't see how much we were hurting you. Laura and we got caught up in our own world. I want to do better. Eleanor nodded, tears in her eyes. She told him about the will. Not to hurt him, but to be honest. I needed to feel like I mattered. She said, this garden, this community, it's where I belong now. Michael didn't argue. He listened, his face a mix of regret and understanding. I don't want to lose you, he said finally. Eleanor reached for his hand, her heart full. You haven't lost me, Michael. I'm still here, but I'm not waiting anymore. They sat in silence, the swing creaking softly, the night air cool and forgiving. The festival marked a turning point. Sophie and Ethan started visiting regularly, helping in the garden and bringing friends. Laura began joining the knitting group, her presence tentative but growing warmer. Michael came by every few weeks, sometimes with a tool to fix a fence, sometimes just to talk. It wasn't the family Eleanor had once dreamed of, but it was real, and it was enough. As spring turned to summer, Eleanor stood in the garden, watching a group of children plant marigolds under Jamal's guidance. Ruth sat nearby, knitting a blanket, her laughter mingling with the breeze. Eleanor felt a deep peace, a sense that she'd found her place. The hurt of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her. She'd cropped her son's family out of her deed, but she'd opened her heart to a new kind of family, one that saw her, valued her, needed her. Summer brought a golden glow to Eleanor's garden, its rows bursting with life. The community center hummed with activity cooking classes, art workshops, storytelling evenings where seniors shared their lives with wide-eyed children. Eleanor was at the heart of it, her days filled with purpose, her nights with a quiet contentment she hadn't known in years. The garden had become a symbol of resilience, not just for her, but for everyone who walked its paths. It was a place where the forgotten found a voice, where the overlooked bloomed. Sophie and Ethan were now regular fixtures, their laughter a new soundtrack to Eleanor's days. Sophie's sketches of the garden decorated the community center's walls, each one capturing the vibrant spirit of the place. Ethan, quieter but thoughtful, had taken to helping Jamal with the greenhouse, learning the science of soil and growth. Eleanor watched them with a mix of pride and gratitude, marveling at how these connections had grown from her pain. Michael and Laura's presence grew steadier. Laura joined the charities board, her organizational skills a quiet apology for years of distance. Michael helped with maintenance, fixing benches and planting new trees. Their visits weren't perfect, there were still awkward silences, moments when old wounds ached but they were trying. Eleanor saw it in the way Michael lingered after a task, asking about her day, or how Laura brought homemade cookies to the knitting group. It was slow, fragile, but real. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Michael asked Eleanor to walk with him. They strolled past the sunflowers, their heads heavy with seeds, and stopped by the orchard where he'd played as a child. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he started, his voice low, about being seen. I failed you, Mom. I let life get in the way, and I didn't see how much it hurt you. Eleanor listened, her heart tight but open. She didn't interrupt, letting him speak. I don't care about the house or the land. Michael continued. I mean, I did, but not anymore. I just want you back in our lives. Sophie and Ethan, they love you. Laura's trying. I promise. And I want to be a better son. His eyes were wet, and Eleanor felt her own tears rise. She hugged him, the first real embrace in years, and whispered, You're still my son. Michael. Always will be. The moment wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was honest. Eleanor knew trust would take time, that the scars of being cropped out wouldn't vanish overnight. But she also knew she'd found her own strength, her own family in the garden and the community. She didn't need Michael's approval to feel whole anymore. But his effort meant more than she could say. The garden's first anniversary was a celebration of everything Eleanor had built. The town gathered for a picnic, with music and laughter filling the air. Ruth gave a speech, her voice strong despite her age, thanking Eleanor for giving them a home. Jamal presented a new design for a children's garden, his confidence blooming like the plants he tended. Sophie and Ethan helped serve food, their smiles bright as they called Eleanor Grandma in front of their friends. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor stood at the edge of the garden, watching the crowd. Clara was there, pouring lemonade, her laughter infectious. Ruth sat with the knitting group, their needles clicking in rhythm. Michael and Laura stood nearby, their hands clasped, watching their children with pride. Eleanor felt a deep peace settle over her, a sense that she'd found her place in the world. She thought of the cropped photo, now tucked away in a drawer, its sting softened by time. She'd been erased from that moment, but she'd written herself into countless others. The garden, the community, the love she'd cultivated, they were her legacy, more enduring than any deed. She'd cropped her son's family out of her property, but she'd opened her heart to them again, on her terms. As the stars appeared, Eleanor walked to the greenhouse, its glass glowing in the moonlight. She touched a young seedling, its leaves soft and new. This was her story, now a story of growth, of resilience, of choosing to bloom where she was planted. And as she looked out at the garden, at the people who filled it, she knew she was no longer a ghost. She was Eleanor Grayson, seen, loved, and home.